Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Sydney Institute giving another speech about a very topical, relevant topic today is COVID-19. And I want to emphasize today what I'm going to be talking about is not just the economic impacts of COVID-19 as a health phenomenon, but in fact mainly the economic impacts of the response to the global crisis, we will say, of COVID-19. So it is in fact, I would say, more of an economic issue, what we have done in response to the virus, than what the virus has done directly to us. So I will start by saying that the costs of the worldwide economic lockdown that we have seen are increasingly obviously stratospheric. China's GDP has gone backwards by something like 7% in the first quarter of 2020. US GDP is expected to fall by 3 to 8% in 2020. In Australia, the projections are for somewhere between a 5 and 6% fall. And that's just in terms of GDP figures. The Guardian even said in mid-April this year, that the pandemic could have profound and potentially long-term impacts on mental health. And my co-presenter is going to be talking a lot about that, but I will touch on some of the economic effects in terms of mental health and human suffering that we're expecting to see because of the global response to COVID-19. In a policy brief published also in mid-April, the UN published a very disturbing set of findings in regard to the impact of COVID-19 on children, which mainly focuses on school children's lack of ability to go to school and the deeper poverty into which they have been thrust, particularly in the developing world. I will emphasize now and again during this talk that the main impact economically of the lockdowns that we have seen around the world is on the most disadvantaged people of the world. And particularly in developing countries, this impact is going to be huge, including things like famines. Within Australia, however, in the short run, what kind of effects will I expect? Well, it's very likely, based on early signs in the data that we do have, that domestic violence is going to be going up, mental health is going to be going down, physical health will be threatened by delayed seeking of health care and checkups for all sorts of maladies other than COVID-19, and obviously incomes have been threatened. Casual and temporary workers will be hit most. As we know, the JobKeeper payment is there. It's doing some bit of the job in trying to keep people's incomes afloat, but it does exclude large categories of workers, and we've seen hundreds of thousands of workers going on to the unemployment rolls in recent times. Also, of course, the higher education sector has been heavily affected because of our extreme dependence on international student fee revenue, which I've spoken about here in the past. And we would expect to see that the hardest hit workers will be in industries affected by the travel bans and other sorts of lockdown measures, including in industries like retail, hospitality, travel, and the performing arts. Because if you're a performing artist, you can't give a concert if people can't come to the venue. We've seen and will continue to see businesses going bankrupt, and more than anything, what we would expect is to have those businesses that have a little bit of slack already able to withstand this sort of crisis more easily than those that were operating closer to the red zone with smaller margins. And so it's the mom and pop businesses, the small businesses, the little entrepreneurships that I would expect to see hit most, with the bigger companies coming out possibly with higher market share at the end of this. In the medium run, one important fact to bear in mind is that recoveries do not come quickly. Recessions aren't V-shaped, as they say. So I would expect that the recovery will take us months, if not years, to actually fully realize, due to mainly destroyed business links, both within Australia and between Australia and companies in our overseas trading partner countries. In the longer run, what we are seeing right now, of course, is some degree of impact on our children because of missed or lower quality education with the lockdowns and the withdrawal of children from overseas universities as well. And that will have impacts for a very long time on that cohort, which I've called the coronavirus cohort in the past. There are also going to be longer run impacts of the domestic violence and higher child abuse and neglect that are happening right now because people are trapped in dysfunctional families. Not that all of Australia's families are dysfunctional, but some are. That will have long run impacts for the lives of those people. And of course, there are also going to be longer run impacts of the crowded out healthcare. Healthcare that would have taken place and prevented future illnesses were it not for the laser focus of the healthcare system on the COVID-19 projected infections and deaths. All of these effects are regressive. They are all going to impact more the more disadvantaged members of our communities. So I want to sort of start with a big picture of what economic activity is all about. Economic activity supports life. It supports human well-being. It supports longevity. It is about human welfare. So I am one of those classical economic philosophers who believes that the point of having a functioning economy is not to have profits, it's not to have lots of money, it's to have good outcomes for people in terms of human welfare. And over many, many decades of study, it has been found that GDP per capita is the biggest predictor of human welfare, longevity, and general good outcomes for people worldwide over history. So that's why GDP per capita is something to aim for. It's not a perfect measure, but it's a rough guide to how well a country is doing. And it's the reason why we would prefer to be born in Australia today than in India, for example. Governments in high income per capita countries spend the money that they are able to collect from the private sector on investments like research and development, and hospitals, schools, support networks for victims of domestic violence and mental illness, on roads, on consumer safety commissions, and many other activities that support the happy, healthy lives of their citizens. This is why income per capita is a good thing. This is why governments have a role. When we don't have as much GDP, when we impair our ability to spend on things other than COVID-19, we take away a little bit from all of those other categories of spending, potentially now and potentially in the future, to the extent that government spending on those other things is crowded out. It's an open question whether the government today will continue to be willing to just print money, essentially, to finance those other kinds of investments, but at the end of the day, you need to have economic activity to keep a country going forward, to support a reasonable quality of spending and quantity of spending by any government. So we do need to get the economy back working again so that our government can continue to spend on things that support our happy, healthy, long lives. Recessions are bad because there is idle capacity sitting around in an economy that is not being used to a productive purpose and generating income, which then, of course, feeds that machine. And the Australian government is trying to compensate the idle capacity in the form of labourers right now who have lost their jobs by massive fiscal stimulus programs like JobKeeper, but the government cannot compensate perfectly for the losses that these workers have felt. There's just too much pain, there are too many different kinds of losses and too many little nooks and crannies and losses going forward for the government to be able to create a Band-Aid that fixes that problem fully. And again, it cannot print money forever. Eventually, you need real economic activity to soak up the money that it spends. So I want to quickly review how economists think about the value of what we're trading off in policy decisions like the one we have been facing the last couple of months. There are a number of measures, and these are well known to health economists, but perhaps less well known to the lay people who may be watching this podcast, and probably not as well known to even non-health economists, so economists who work in areas other than health. The first is the value of a statistical life. The idea here is if an individual, for example, is willing to pay $5 to reduce her chance of dying this year by 1 in a million, then her value of a statistical life is that $5 divided by 1 in a million, or $5 million. The VSL estimate used in calculations by consumer safety commissions in regard to things like speed limit setting, optimal speed limit setting, is generally somewhere between $2 and $11 million per life. Now, it's not nice to put a number on lives, a dollar figure. It's not comfortable. We don't like it. But at the end of the day, because we live in a world of scarce resources, somebody's got to put a figure on that in order to come up with a policy setting for an example, the speed limit. In some sense, somebody said at one stage, only an economist would ask the question, what is the optimal number of dead babies? Which basically means, what's the optimal speed limit? You know some babies are going to die when you have a speed limit above 5 kilometers an hour. But you also don't want to impede economic activity to the extent that it would be if you set the speed limit at 5 kilometers per hour. So you have to balance these concerns. Any economist approaches a policy question like this by thinking in terms of trade-offs. Another very common currency for the value of a life is the quality adjusted life year, or QALY. In this currency, a year of perfect health is worth 1 QALY, and a year of less than perfect health is worth less than 1. Death is considered to be equivalent to 0, although some health states might be considered to be worse than death and might have a negative value. Typically, in studies around the world, a value of somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 per QALY is used. And this is used by governments, typically in health ministries, when deciding via cost-benefit analysis how much money to spend on different types of investments that may support health. We have to do this because we have a limited envelope to spend on every disease and illness that may affect mankind. And so how much goes to cancer versus how much goes to heart disease versus how much goes to disability support, those are decisions that are wrenching and very difficult and fraught philosophically, morally, and otherwise, and we need a currency with which to grapple with those problems. And the QALY is the most commonly used one. So one thing that's been striking in this debate in Australia about how to approach the COVID-19 crisis is that I haven't seen estimates from the government in relation to QALYs. How many QALYs are being saved and how many QALYs are being sacrificed by our policy settings. But that is exactly the sort of currency that one would expect this discussion to be had in, if it were done in the same way that we typically discuss preservation and supporting of life. Now, there's also another basic unit of analysis, and I won't go into this in detail, but it's a newly suggested one, new on the scene. It's called the WELLBE, and it essentially allows us to analyze and capture unhappiness effects, such as stress due to unemployment, financial strain, increased risk of domestic violence, and so far. And in this currency, 1 point of change in life satisfaction for one person for 1 year, when measured on a 0 to 10 scale, is a WELLBE. As a rule of thumb, the average year of life in a richer country is worth about 6 WELLBEs, because we have a reasonably good quality of life in richer countries. It's less in poorer countries with lower qualities of life. And then a whole life would then be worth, say it's 80 years long, something like 480 WELLBEs. That then allows you to develop an understanding of what is being sacrificed when we inflict the suffering that we've seen under the economic lockdowns. So I won't go into specific numbers about what the currencies that I've just discussed would indicate have been the costs for Australia of the lockdowns, but suffice to say they have been pretty substantial. In my back of the envelope calculations, they've been also suggested in the media and increasingly talked about as something we should be considering when moving forward in our policy directions. So with that, basically the method would be in evaluating any policy to discuss what are the options, and the option that we have right now is not the one we had 2 months ago. We do not have the option of not having a lockdown at all. We've had a lockdown for a while. Our decision now is, do we continue it or do we end it, for example, a month earlier? To decide that, one would ask how many statistical lives in Australia would be sacrificed by keeping the lockdown in place compared to how many lives would be saved, for example, from COVID-19 deaths, were we to keep that lockdown in place for the extra month. Okay? As I say, my back of the envelope calculation indicates that we should have this discussion. It's not obvious at all. I will say also, just finally in closing, to get perspective, that the number of deaths per day in Australia is something like 300 and some odd. And we've had 75 or so people die of COVID-19 over the past 2 months. This is about 20% of the number we typically lose in a day. Even if we were to have followed Sweden's path, which has had something a little under 2,500 deaths so far, scaling up to Australia's population, that would have seen us lose something like 7,000 people. That's still very, very well within the range that we would have expected over a couple of months period. And all but a handful of these deaths have been in people over 70, for whom the quality adjusted life years remaining is reasonably small. The negative effects, on balance, have been felt by the younger generation, which is why I've described this elsewhere as a massive cost shift from the older people to the younger people in our society. We're making promising strides already in treatment. I'm very confident, because the entire world is focused on this, that we're going to see treatments, possibly a vaccine, but certainly treatments that lessen the fatality rate from this disease over the next 3 to 6 months. And this will also reduce the stress on our healthcare infrastructure. The measured lethality of the virus already varies a lot between countries. There are many things we still have to understand about the virus, including its sensitivity to geographical and cultural factors, and I'm sure we'll be learning a lot about that as we move forward. But I would ask if a second and more virulent wave of this virus does emerge in our winter, for example, I have to wonder whether a strategy more like Sweden's, which may not be directed towards the creation of herd immunity, but has the side effect of producing a lot more exposures to the virus and therefore some potential immunological defense against it, might have been a better approach for Australia. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to speak to you today in unusual circumstances. And I thank Jared Ann and everyone else involved in the Sydney Institute for keeping it humming along and attempting to make sure that intellectual life is not as disrupted as so many other features of our daily routines. Now, I've been asked to speak about the mental health effects, to follow Gigi, who gave a great analysis of some of the economic considerations. And there'll obviously be a bit of overlap, and Gigi mentioned some of the health-related matters, and I'll touch on that a bit more. So really, when we think of the mental health effects and its lingering consequences, if we like, I'm going to break it down into a few sort of broad-based themes, and we can perhaps save some more for the discussion afterwards. Let's think of it, it's an unusual crisis in that it's obviously a manufactured crisis. The government has effectively created it in terms of the economic side, and we certainly haven't had a pandemic-induced economic crisis, certainly not in anyone's lifetime. The Spanish flu coincided very closely with World War I. So in terms of the social and mental health effects, we can break it down to the immediate effects of lockdown, and then the separate effects associated with what we might call, say, the twin crises, both health and economic. So mental health is in the background of both of those crises, and when we consider the mental health effects, it's utterly grounded in the social effects, utterly grounded in the social changes and the social impacts. And to try and predict it, we can certainly look at past crises and compare and think what might be different in the current setting. So look, I think to begin with, I think we can think of just this what we're going through at the moment, albeit it's certainly a little bit better in Australia than some other places, just the very notion of lockdown and how we can look at that. I mean, if you think of humans where, one of the worst punishments we have is, say, prisoners, for example, they get put into isolation. Astronauts talk about, going absolutely mad, being in sort of enclosed space on their own for months on end. So isolation is a real punishment, and it's quite anti-human in many respects. Now, unlike other parts of Europe, we don't have the same sort of spectre of death around the corner. If you're in Italy, Spain, London, New York City, that is very much there. So you're sort of locked in, and meanwhile there's sort of sounds of ambulances. Most people would know someone or be connected to someone who is in intensive care or has died. And that certainly has a way of focusing one's attentions in terms of the deepest sort of moral and philosophical issues, which at a day-to-day level we may not necessarily encounter. So on that level, it certainly forces people to reappraise things in a whole host of ways. Lockdown itself, I mean, in terms of studies, in terms of modern studies, the most obvious one is one that was conducted in Canada during the SARS epidemic. And for several months they were able to monitor people in quarantine there. And I guess it's fairly predictable, after sort of 6 to 8 weeks, they were able to see quite typical symptoms of what would be called, say, diagnosed anxiety disorders and certainly depressed mood. And I guess one thing they didn't expect, even some features of symptoms they associated with traumatic syndromes like nightmares or flashbacks, of what specific events. I guess it's often more thoughts of associated with the illness or things they've seen or heard, and re-experiencing that. So that's something not completely unexpected, but gives a sense of the intensity of the response that may occur in a similar sort of society. I think we should make that comparison. The reality is, around the world, I mean, we live in one of the most prosperous, peaceful societies in human history. So our threshold for what might be considered traumatic is likely to be different, and that will, to some extent, inform some of the symptoms and psychological effects that people may experience. And then, to some extent, our experience is mitigated by technology. I mean, it's only in the last, say, 10, 15 years you could be in the house and be on the internet, work from home, Zoom each other, etc. So that is mitigating some of the effects. So even though we have, and almost certainly we have an economic recession, there is of course a parallel social recession, but to some extent that social recession is being mitigated through technology. So what we might call social distancing is, I think it's worth thinking of that more as a physical distancing, and the social side can vary according to the type of person and the efforts one makes, and you'll see a lot of articles around this time, slightly humorous and a bit more tongue-in-cheek, but with some truth in it as well, comparing, say, different personality types and how they might behave in lockdown. And I think the typical thing is the idea of the introvert, the one who may be slightly more socially avoidant, they're energised by solitude. That group is, to some extent, quite enjoying the circumstances, because the usual day-to-day hum of a sort of modern service economy very much favours the extrovert, where meetings or open plan offices, there's a performative aspect to social life and working life that favours the extrovert. And to some extent our current circumstances is dimming that, and there's less pressure on those that kind of behaviour doesn't come automatically or naturally. And to be frank, I'm seeing that in some of my patients. There'd be several, I've had more than a handful of patients that I may have expected to become worse during such a time, those that say severe anxiety disorders, when in fact many of them, and this is actually a point that the Gonzo author, that many of you will be familiar with, John Ronson, I saw him actually speak about this on the BBC, where he said he himself talked about having an anxiety disorder and knowing many others who did, and many of them spoke that they didn't actually feel any worse, and to some extent they felt better. And I certainly have a theory for this, and I would say one of the reasons is because the current threat is more shared. It's a shared threat, whereas a great deal of mental health problems, especially in Western society, are about sort of suffering alone, and almost an outcrop of, say, excessive individualism, if you like. So to some extent, some people that have pre-existing mental health disorders, while you might expect them to get worse, they're not necessarily getting worse. One, they have a sense of genuine threat, and they always felt the world was especially threatening. So now it's confirmed, and and a lot of people that were previously sane are feeling equally threatened, but also that they're feeling it's a shared context. So many of them are not necessarily getting worse in the way you might think. So that's one aspect of being in lockdown, and just the very nature of, say, working from home, etc. That obviously creates a whole set of new circumstances. I mean, collapses that sort of the boundary that we place between sort of a productive sphere and a domestic sphere. It has various impacts on gender, which I will speak to a little bit more. And in fact, I heard an economist, and I'm sure Gigi will have views about this too, and it's something I'm writing about in an upcoming column, that I've heard economists talk about this as possibly the first crisis where the government is actually treating the economic unit of the home as a dual income. Whereas in previous crises, policy would have been set with the idea of a male breadwinner. So I think that's a very interesting point, and a sign that this crisis will be handled slightly differently, particularly in that social component. So I think that broad thing that lockdown has its own potential consequences. I think they will be relatively limited in Australia. We haven't had this intensity of lockdown or the length of lockdown that others have, and already looks like some of that will be loosened. I think it is heightened for some people. While I spoke about some people with severe anxiety disorders possibly not worsening, I think other groups, like, say, grandparents, etc., that we've essentially isolating for their health purposes, I think for many of them it can be especially lonely and not having that touch. I mean, we're such sensual, that aspect of touch is really critical, and just missing that for an extended period, I think, has a whole range of negative psychological impacts. Now, the other side I want to talk about is that economic side, and how does that affect mental health. And I think to consider that, we need to look at past crises. I mean, there was a very notable study on this in the British Journal of Psychiatry in 2014, and that looked very specifically at the global financial crisis in 2007, and looked at it over for several years, and in a whole range of countries. And I think it's very instructive. And again, it was another crisis where Australia got off pretty lightly. And so we're very lucky in some of these major crises where we're cushioned quite significantly. But when that crisis was looked about, there's some very interesting trends which mirror past crises. So one, male suicide tends to go up significantly, by 3 to 4 times. Female suicide is usually fairly steady. It doesn't necessarily change dramatically. And I guess one of the main theories of that is the male breadwinner role is diminished. You have many jobs lost. I guess the more traditional male role of the breadwinner, the protector, the provider is diminished, and that takes an especially hefty toll on many men, and for them suicide rates seem to increase significantly. And that's actually mirrored in other parts, like the Great Depression. Was a fairly similar trend, where I think the suicide rates sort of were 3 times higher in the United States, similar rates in parts of Europe. So that's an interesting aspect of gender, whereas the female domestic role actually becomes more important. It becomes heightened. So in some ways, it almost gives a stronger sense of purpose to many of the women, and the opposite for some men, at least historically. And not only that, many of the caring jobs, so the Great Depression actually saw one of the biggest shifts of women to working roles. So female employment, I've got a statistic here, went up 24% in the early 1930s during the Great Depression. So there's a good example of how gender roles can differ significally. And rightly so, but a lot of women would say, well, hang on, at the same time, women are often taking the bulk of the caring roles then, and especially now you look at homeschooling, potentially looking after the elderly, if not seeing them physically, often organising the various things grandparents or parents, etc. need. So there is a definite extra load that may fall upon women in this context. But at the same time, I would argue this may be the first crisis where men will take, it's certainly not the bigger portion, but they will take arguably the biggest component of that, at least historically. So especially in a place like Australia, certainly more men taking on, say, stay-at-home roles or teaching roles, or the second income type roles. And one of the things I'm interested in is, my hope is also that one of the things we need in the economy is this shift from blue collar to what's sometimes called pink collar, the caring industries, be it disability, carers, nurses, etc. And my hope is, and under the guise that many crises or epidemics often speed up historical trends, be it the rush to digital and a host of other trends, kind of diluting multilateralism, but on this level, I'm hoping it will shift that trend, the shift of men from blue collar to pink collar jobs. That may be aided by policy to some extent. And I guess the other social thing that we might hope for is that the current circumstances, there's a much stronger, a half a century of expressive individualism, or a focus on individual autonomy, is kind of diluted by the morality of public health. It's a very different type of morality. So suddenly there's a lot more about mutual obligation, and you look at some of the ways that people are behaving. So that may also be a social trend, which I hope to some extent will be overall beneficial. It's unlikely to stay in that same context, but that's one of the things I'm hoping for. Now, it's worth thinking of different countries around the suicide. For example, Greece did especially poorly between 2007 and 2009. Other countries like Sweden, Austria, Iceland did reasonably well. And I guess one of the theories there is their health and social safety net, if you like, was much stronger. Greece, there was a lot of sort of austerity imposed on Greece, be it cutbacks to health budgets, HIV, for example, increased significantly, partly because there were lots of cutbacks on needle exchange programs. So even though countries may suffer similar economic circumstances, the health and social responses that are then undertaken can mitigate the potential mental health effects. And the US in some ways sits in between. 2009 was the 1 year in the last half century where suicide was greater than car accidents. So that's an example of the effect of the global financial crisis there in the US. And binge drinking also increased significantly. And I guess more recently we've had things like the deaths of despair associated with oxycodone and some of the opiate addiction. But it's an example that there'll be a variety of mental health effects, and then they can be thoroughly mitigated according to government response. Now look, I guess the final thing, I'm wary of time, just one thing I want to touch on is close to my job. A big part of mental health in the last 20 years in particular is this idea of the disability sector, where you've had a huge increase in the portion of the mental health component of disability. And what we talk about is a generational trend from bad backs, which is really where the notion of the disability pension came from, to troubled minds. And we've had a huge increase that. I'll try and find some numbers here. In the years between 2001 and 2014, there was a 50% increase in those receiving the pension for psychiatric reasons. The growth stalled a little since 2012 because eligibility requirements were tightened by the Gillard government, and that has caused something of a decline. But part of the disability pension was significantly higher than New Start, and those debates are going on too at the moment. Now, the point I want to make is that we have an underclass of the long-term unemployed and those on the disability pension that are becoming more entrenched. So the coarsening of what you might call welfare dependents was closely linked with mental health conditions and substance abuse. And what I want to potentially put this proposition that one of the reasons I think that's the case is we've also suffered for probably several decades a stigmatisation to some extent of jobs in the bottom end of the labour market. And that's something I've seen in my work. So the dignity is something that was so Western. I remember seeing a speech by Narendra Modi, who when he came to Australia, he said one of the great things about the Western world is that just the ordinary, the cleaner, the driver, who it is, still is given an equal dignity as compared to, say, the caste system in India or other parts of the world. And I think that is the case to an extent, but I actually think that has diminished in recent decades. And something I see in my work, where many people, there's almost a fine line between those who might look for work, but they would almost see a better dignity in being on the disability pension than doing what they might consider lowly work. So that end of the labour market has been populated a lot by temporary migrants and a host of other essentially, many groups that we've imported. So I want to finish with this point. With the whole essential worker thing, there's been an improvement, I think, in the notion of dignity and the essential work, or what might previously be called ordinary work. And my hope, with no evidence for this at all, is that may improve the idea of the dignity of ordinary work, and that might have an impact at that section of the labour market, the section of long-term unemployed, New Start, disability, and there's a kind of interaction, and mental health conditions. And my hope is that it may improve some of the numbers there in the longer term. I don't think it will happen in the short term. So there's some thoughts. Thank you, Jared, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Gigi, and thanks, Tanveer, for a great presentation. So I thought I'd start first on the topic that Gigi raised about the disadvantaged, and then go briefly to the topic that you raised about dignity. Now, it seems to me that if you look at particularly ABC programs where people go on air and as commentators, not you on Q&A the other day, but people go on air and say, look, we're all working at home, without realising that most people are not working from home. They may be at home minding children, but people who are doing cleaning, driving buses, building buildings, constructing roads, they're not at home. And many of those who are at home don't have computers, and people who have computers don't have as many computers as they have children very on. So it seems to me that, necessary though the social distancing provisions are, they do seem to hit very heavily at those who are not in professional employment.
I completely agree. And the point about children is particularly important. The fact that we've closed schools or strongly encouraged children to be learning online means that not only do the children in the more disadvantaged areas go into an environment which is arguably less supportive of their learning than a school would be, but they are also underfoot and need to be cared for by members of our labor force who otherwise, would be potentially more productive. So I would definitely say that's a regressive and highly damaging impact of the school closures. And I think if we were going to take one step towards opening up the economy, the first one we should take is to put kids back in school.
Tanveer?
Look, I mean, you often hear this component, we're sort of all in it together and the virus doesn't discriminate. But I do think there are, class and socioeconomic dimensions to the virus. Not necessarily something we've seen specifically, but it's just straight out in deaths. One thing I didn't talk about in the gender thing, I mean, men are 3 times more likely to die of coronavirus, and we think that's linked to sort of immune systems. If you look at a place like New York, where the biggest impact was in Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, where the highest number of deaths were, I mean, the people coming in were often all the essential workers. They were the ones driving the taxis, they were the ones on the tube, the subway, if you like, they were the ones still out in the world, interacting with people, and far more likely to be exposed to the virus. So from a pure deaths point of view, I think there is a class dimension. But I mean, what Gigi said is absolutely true. And this is something I'm seeing regularly. As parents coming with people on the autistic spectrum and trying to teach them from home. And I think there's a middle class component, realistic, which we're all part of, that don't necessarily see this if you're in an office job, etc. And they think everybody's got a great internet and can do a job from home. I mean, that's just not the case, and I think that's flowing through to this debate about the school closures.
Now, you didn't mention this in this talk, but your practice is in Western Sydney?
Variety. I sort of work primarily in Blacktown is my private practice. I have a public component in Bankstown in southwest Sydney, and then I also work in the CBD, which is more legal, insurance, that kind of stuff.
So you've got a pretty good grasp of differing levels of economic achievement that you're dealing with. Well, let's now go to the issue of dignity. I mean, both of you, I think, mentioned the Spanish flu of 1918, mainly 1919. I think the estimated deaths was 15,000. 12 is the official figure, but some weren't accounted for, so let's say 15. In Australia, if Australia had the current population then that it has now, that would be about 75,000 deaths. But it was a different society as well. If you look at dignity, it seems to me now that to some extent you've got a division between those who have permanent employment or very secure employment, who have one view on social distancing, and those who have insecure employment or casual employment who have another view on it. And also it's notable that whilst the public sector was pretty small around 1919, it did run across various provisions. You had professional people in the public sector, you had a lot of workers in the public sector as well, but as public sector got privatised over a century, essentially now the public sector group is a professional group, and those who are in lower level employment and by and large are not in the public sector. So how do you see that kind of clash between those in secure employment, those in unsecure employment? Do you notice anything different in your practice for that kind of group, or you don't?
I mean, look, it's still early days, but I guess what you're alluding to is one of the big, fault lines of modern politics, where, whether it's Charles Murray or, the anywheres, everywhere, that sort of somewheres that's been argued, where you have a growing professional class, the knowledge worker, who's increasingly distant from the aspirations and experiences of, say, your suburban worker, often working in the public sector or casualised employment, shift work. look, I guess the most obvious thing, that group, there's a much greater economic insecurity amongst the second group that we're alluding to, and there's a much bigger desperation for them to go out to work, but often their work, as we spoke about, has probably an element of greater risk because they're dealing with the riffraff, if you like. They're dealing with the public, and they have less control over who comes face to face with them or close to them. So I think the urgency in terms of the trade-off of the economic debate and the easing of restrictions, that falls the hardest. Whereas the professional group, many of them working from home, and many of them kind of, their biggest whinge might be, trying to do teleconferences on their computer, etc. And there are frustrations from working from home. I don't doubt it for a second. But the same level of potential desperation and potential lack of funds, of work, and a much greater desperation of the future is not as apparent in the professional classes.
So I totally agree with that. I would just add that there is an age dimension to this as well, because it is just more likely that a casual worker is younger. And that means that also, because those younger people have a lower risk of death from COVID-19, they are looking at different odds. When they think about, well, if I were to go back to work, what would my risk really be? Well, it would be less if you're 20 than if you're 60. And the 20-year-old is just more likely to have a casual position or somehow be precariously attached to the labor force. And I think this also gets to the question of the longer run impacts on that generation and on then Australia's industrial mix going forward. Where are those workers going to be soaked up? And we've got almost 1 million people who've been applying for unemployment benefits. Again, we are not going to bounce right back from this. Those links that have been severed between employers and employees and between supply chain members all across, from Australia, overseas, whatever, those are going to take a long time to rebuild. It takes a long time to re-find partners to trade with, to produce with. And so it's actually an opportunity for Australia to decide what it wants to be in 5 years, where it wants to be industrially, and to figure out how to soak those workers up. And one option is actually what Tanveer spoke about a bit, of trying to get some of those maybe semi-skilled, unskilled workers who have been thrown out of a casual position, more laboring type position perhaps, to have them transition into some of the occupations we know that we need and we're going to need more of, such as aged care support, nursing, teaching, the caring occupations, the pink collar work.
But I think it's fair to say, if we go to the figures you gave at the commencement of your talk, about the drop in gross domestic product, and you mentioned China, you mentioned Australia and the United States and elsewhere, it is likely, as you're implying here, that this unemployment, particularly for younger people and older people, it looks likely it's going to take a long time to go down.
Absolutely.
It looks even grimmer perhaps than the latter years of the 1930s.
Yes, one of the things that saved us from the more extended depression at that time was, of course, the Second World War. Let's hope that we don't have such a life raft this time around. But one of the lessons we might draw from that period is, in fact, the kinds of fiscal stimulus directions that the American government pursued at the time. So the New Deal policies, which soaked up a lot of labor. That was the whole point, right? And of a lot of those programs that produced this infrastructure, like the Hoover Dam and other infrastructure some of it's never been replaced. The Australian government could potentially, instead of just handing out money to people in a temporary way until September, when supposedly the payments stop and people are going to be that much more insecure financially and otherwise, it could embark on a more proactive strategy to grow certain sectors of the economy through hiring those kinds of workers to produce infrastructure that will be with us for a long time.
But there are no easy solutions. There are, as you know, because in the United States in 1938, you had a second depression, which in Britain and Australia we didn't have. So we had a gradual recovery. In the United States there was a recovery and then a second depression in 38. Then the war commences for the US around, they're involved in 40, around the end of 41. So if you're putting people into government jobs, they've got to be paid for by the government, don't they?
And it's not ideal, but it's a way to at least try to use the opportunity that we have now. As you said, this is going to be a long recovery. The government has to do something, or else we're going to have a lot of suffering in this country. And I am a supporter of the JobKeeper program. I am a supporter of the idea that one should engage in Keynesian stimulus when there's a recession.
Do you mean like a New Deal or something equivalent? Yeah.
Something like this, right? And you'd have to think about where do we want to take the economy. I mean, there are a lot of options on the table, and it's a once in a lifetime, once in a generation chance to take some serious, action by the government that will help spur the economy in a direction that the private sector will then hopefully come in and be able to compete in towards comparative advantage in Australia, towards the areas where we should be producing more. And I think, I don't know whether it's going to happen, but I'd love to see some discussions about that.
So earlier in your talk, you spoke about, you thought that people with anxiety were handling this better than might be expected because they were sharing the anxiety with people who hadn't previously had the anxiety. But the impact of long-term unemployment on the kind of people you see day to day, both if it occurs in the CBD and if it occurs in the suburbs where you work a fair bit of your time, that would be pretty grim.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think one thing I'd add, this sort of thing does clarify purpose in a whole set of areas. So an aspect of particularly Western mental health, was partly a luxury good. A small portion of it, where there's a lot of people kind of going, oh, what's the point of my life? How do I be totally fulfilled in all my aspects of life? That bit is it's clarifying purpose and people going back to essentials, that Maslow hierarchy of needs. And we see that in the corporate sector too. So suddenly the banks aren't worrying about whether they support gay marriage or not, or the millennials not worried about whether their job reflects their values adequately. They just need a job, and a bank needs to function like a bank. So some of those things are clarifying purpose. There's no question you'll get different kind of layers. Even in mental health, you'll get a much more practical component to mental health. People without the economy needs to survive jobs. If someone's depressed because they don't have a job, there's a very good reason. There's no number of tablets are going to fix that problem. We can help them adjust to it and solve problems. But in the longer term, anyone unemployed who would traditionally have a job in a well-functioning economy, they have twice the risk of suicide. Twice the risk. So that's very significant. I think in modern Western societies, there has been a component of the unemployed that sort of exists on that long-term unemployed, welfare dependence. There's been a component of that, and part of that is possibly a luxury good too that poorer countries most certainly did not have. But in terms of the effect of unemployment, the loss of purpose, all these dreams collapsing, and there's no question that will have a short-term mental impact. But ideally, that can be mitigated. I think that was one of the key points that I wanted to raise in the topic. That you can have several countries with similar economic impacts, but then the health, social safety net, and then what government policy does can actually mitigate that very significantly in terms of the social or mental health impacts.
So you're suggesting that pronoun awareness is on the decline, is it?
Well, elective surgeries are back almost.
So as coming out in the economy, you're talking about big government initiatives, which the private sector may lash onto, but that's going to be hugely costly.
Yeah.
So how does the borrowed money ever get paid back, or doesn't it matter?
Well, it depends, I suppose, whether you're in the more classical monetary theory camp or the modern monetary theory camp. But one thing that those two camps agree about very much is that the amount of money circulating in the economy needs to be calibrated to the amount of economic activity happening in the economy. And at the end of the day, the goal of the policies we set now has got to be to get the private sector back on its feet, because the private sector is the generator of so many jobs and so much progress in society. Now, the private sector indirectly then supports government spending, as I spoke about in my talk, and that's that government spending that creates the kind of social support network that enables us to have long lives and happy lives in Australia, have luxury problems like whether or not somebody wants to be, he or she or whatever else. And we generally consider ourselves lucky in Australia. So it's this partnership between the private sector and the public sector, which is a feature of a successful, thriving society. And so what we want in the future is not a lot more presence of the public sector, nor really a lot less presence of the public sector. We want, that combination of public and private activity which supports Australia's prospering in the future. And of course that does mean right now we're going to have a lot of public expenditure because the private sector is, we have bankruptcies, we've got, destruction of links, all these things that have happened. And so there's a role right now for a larger amount of government activity, which hopefully within 5 to 10 years will have been sucked out by the private sector.
But in the meantime, as you know, if there's no work around, employers can't keep workers on even if they're getting government subsidies because there's nothing for them to do except stand in the corner.
Paint rocks.
And a lot of the businesses that close down, it would seem, unfortunately, any business that closed down is going to have a great struggle opening. I mean, the government sector, if it, let's say there's a government-funded zoo, I mean, if they have to lay off some staff, they can always bring them back on. But if it's a private zoo, if you lay off staff, the chances of getting back are very grim.
Absolutely, and this is the destruction of links problem, right? Once that company goes under, all the links it had to all the workers it had are destroyed. So then those workers are floating out in space, they're idle capacity, the owner of the business is idle capacity, his capital is idle capacity, and it has to be reabsorbed somehow. Now the government can help that process along by financing, underwriting, subsidizing some kinds of activities in the short run. That's part of what Keynesian stimulus does.
I might just conclude, I think we're pretty well up to time, just about flashing back a century. I'm not an expert on the Spanish flu, I've read a bit about it. But if you look through the newspapers at the time, both in Australia and the United States, I'm not so sure about, but in Australia, Australian rules football kept going for a whole season, rugby league kept going for a whole season, some of the cinemas closed, but it seems that people are prepared to accept on their behalf today. So Tanveer, does that tell you anything about the change in society, or is it that we just know more about medicine? Because if you look back to the literature of the time, coming out of the end of the First World War, and there was people put in isolation if they came to Australia and whatever else, but the economy seemed to go on. It seemed to me that less was closed down than we're talking about 100 years later.
I think that's just a marker of how prosperous we are, how entitled we are, and our expectations, and that overlaps with Gigi's debate about life years. I think the modern Western economy, particularly a place like Australia, as much as I support many of the ideas around life years adjusted, I just don't think politically there's a tolerance for that. And it's partly why governments have, arguably, in some areas possibly overreacted. So I think we just live in a very different time of extreme prosperity, and also we have very little contact with death. Like, death's probably a lot more frightening than it was a century ago, and it was a lot less visible than it was a century ago. And I think that's another factor here in terms of the types of responses we're having. I mean, I think in a lot of poorer parts of the world, there's people, like I can speak a little, just anecdotally, say, with relatives we have in Bangladesh, which is my birthplace. There's probably 10 times the number of, at least 10, probably 20, 30, the number of actual deaths. But it's something that's happening in the background, and almost philosophy is, as an economy, we can't afford to shut the economy down too much. We just can't afford it. So we have to just take the hit of a set of deaths. But I don't think a society like Australia could tolerate that.
So just his point, I think, in conclusion, and finish on your own comment on this, but what Tanveer's saying is the more prosperous economy, the more you've got to close it down.
Well, I think that actually the inability to speak in terms of qualities, the political incompatibility of that with people's thought process is a luxury problem. I mean,
we can actually afford to do this.
Death is a reality, right? Death is a reality, and implicitly we do make these decisions all the time, every day in our departments of health. At the federal level and the state level. These decisions happen. The fact that the Australian constituent wants to put his head in the sand and say, no, there is no trade-off in the world between lives, that is a problem that hampers our ability to have these discussions openly, and it holds back our political debates. So I absolutely think that we should be pushing for those discussions, as morally wrenching as it may be, and point to other countries, developing countries, where they have to have these discussions. They recognize how important the economy is, and they have to make some hard choices. I think one of the reasons that politicians have moved in the direction they have, a big reason, is not that they initially were the ones leading the charge towards the lockdowns, but because the public was so scared, particularly in developed countries, so scared by reports on the media, by images of body bags in the streets of Italy, and this notion of ICUs overrunning and nurses falling over. It's very scary, and we didn't have that kind of media back in 1920. And we didn't have the luxury of stopping economies. And so I think there's been this fear reaction that politicians have been forced to recognize in their moves towards lockdown. So I do think there was an extreme hysteria here, which has cost us lives on net.
Just a final practical point. So the most prosperous countries also have the most aged populations. So that is a practical consideration here. So they were also the most vulnerable.
Well, many thanks to both of you, in particular for not using the word conversations and talking about discussions. That's
or
very
unprecedented.
important.
Nobody said that today, which is great.
No one used conversations. We spoke about discussions. So look, thank you. Very informative, both Gigi Foster and Tanveer Ahmed. And we'll love to have you back when we're out of virtual reality and back at the Sydney Institute. But for tonight, thanks a lot. Well done.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.